stability on the continent and the African Continental Free Trade area, the constructing implications. We are, as the African Diaspora Forum, an organization that deals with the migrants, and one of the challenges that we face is that many countries across the continent, they see South Africa as industrialized, so you have migration that is down south. It is not spreading across the continent, and you know the challenges that it then brings. My sister, thank you so much.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
And happy Africa Day.
Thank you.
Africa Day is one of those days that I think a lot of people in the world, in Africa itself, here in South Africa, if you were to ask your child what Africa Day means to them, if they even know that there is such a thing, most probably they don't know about it. Mm-hmm. And there is an indictment on us because I think as Africans we fail to look at our history and to preserve it and to talk about it and to teach our children about it. You go to other countries around the world and you see how their museums are filled with everything that they have ever done, the good, the bad, and everything. Yet in Africa, we, for some reason, have this tendency of just forgetting and moving on very fast and not looking back. And if we continue to do that, how do you go forward when you do not know your past and you do not deal with it and you make sure that the generations that come after you are actually part of that so that everyone is of the same vision going forward? So as we celebrate this 60th anniversary of the OAU, it is said that Africa remains the poorest and most underdeveloped continent on the planet, despite us being the continent blessed with the most natural resources on Earth. In 1960, China was poorer than the DRC, poorer than Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Kenya, Liberia, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. In 1960, there are people here who were born before 1960. Today, China stands as the world's second largest economy and one that has been able to eradicate extreme poverty. Despite many initiatives, millions of people on the continent remain in extreme poverty. Africa remains divided and ridden with conflicts. Our founders must be turning in their graves when they see the failures and the damage that those that have come after them have been party to. One of the biggest problems that has scoured the continent since independence has been the endless conflicts. In 2013, the African Union came up with the Silencing the Guns by 2020 initiative. 2020 has come and gone, and Africa is still riddled by conflicts. From liberation conflicts to a growth in violent extremism, terrorism, conflicts linked to the excess of resources, and constitutional changes of government, coup d'etats, which had been in decline but which have in recent years increased, all continue to afflict the continent. The face of the conflict changes, but the root causes stay the same. Conflict is not the natural order of things for Africa. What continues to sustain conflict on the continent is a failure to deal decisively with the root causes. Some fundamental issues that have never been dealt with are the effects that colonialism and the decolonization process have had on governments. The colonies were formed and demarcated based on artificial borders that did not reflect the reality of the people. That did not reflect the reality of the people living in those lands. We have never dealt with those borders and redrawn them to reflect the cultures and histories of the peoples that live there, but have in fact protected these foreign drawn borders with all the problems that they continue to bring. Colonialism was never meant to allow for democratic formations. The colonial state was there to subjugate the population and keep it subservient. It was also meant to extract as much as possible, as Minister Rob Davis had said, from the colonized country's wealth and from its people. Colonial states only cared about their countries of origin and ensuring that the coffers of those capitals were constantly fed and filled. Development in the colonies be damned. At independence, the post-colonial state inherited these institutions, ones that did not care about the people beyond ensuring that they bowed to authority. This is one of the continuing factors that have contributed to conflict. The post-independence state has failed in its duty to protect and provide for its citizens and to develop the countries economically, politically, or socially. Instead, the political elites have become removed from the population and have failed to provide even the most basic of services. What African leaders have continued to do is to extract from their people, much the same as the colonial state, for their own enrichment. Even though Africa is wealthy in natural resources, the state has failed to manage these resources properly, leading to some of the minerally richest countries in the world being some of the most poor ones with the most poverty. This is compounded by the fact that African leaders continue to enforce policies that do not work for their people. There is a poverty of developmental ideas, and even when these ideas are promulgated by progressive academics and intellectuals, these are discarded by decision makers as they do not conform to what they have imbibed and believed to be proper policies. So we keep treading water without any forward movement and no change of course. Later today, we might be told that the interest rate has increased yet again in South Africa, while people are already struggling. And when we have the levels of unemployment that you only see in countries that are at war, yet we keep doing the same thing over and over again, and economists such as Duma Gqubule, who offer a different way of doing things, are constantly being shunned aside and not listened to because there's only one way of dealing with inflation, and that is to increase interest rates. The lack of delivery and poverty of ideas often results in increased protests against the state, particularly violent protests. Protests occur and increase in intensity because of grievances and the frustration of unmet aspirations for change, and the inability or unwillingness of government to respond effectively. This is very soon followed by attempts to undermine the process of government transition. This can happen through the rigging of elections or when incumbents lose elections but refuse to accept the results, or those that win elections then excluding certain portions of the population. Popular protests are one way of being able to measure the likelihood that a country will go through a contested government transition, which can lead to conflict. Soon people lose trust in the government and the governance system and look to actors that appear to have the people's best interests at heart. which might lead to unconstitutional changes of governments in those countries. When people are discontent and their needs are not being met by their governments, it becomes easy for people to be pulled into the ambit of extremists and terrorist factions, as has been seen in parts of the Sahel, Horn of Africa, and in Mozambique. External forces, of course, also continue to play a role in making the continent unstable. Conflicts such as the one started by the US-led NATO in Libya have contributed greatly to the destabilization and conflict on the continent, especially in the Sahel. The number of small arms that are available due to the war in Libya and because of returning fighters from that war coming back into their countries, they have also contributed and been cited for the increase in coup d'etats on the continent in recent times. This is exacerbated by the inability of African states to control the means of violence. Arms are supposed to be controlled by the state, but this does not happen. The illicit financial flows also fan the flames of conflict, as they allow arms to be traded with impunity. But they also leave African countries at a financial disadvantage and unable to meet their obligations towards their people. This is becoming an even bigger threat, as there is likely to be an increase in the intensity of conflicts brought about by environmental change, leading to people's lives becoming even more of a struggle as the access to water and land are affected. Illicit financial flows, readily available cheap but deadly small arms and light weapons, are likely to increase the risk of the outbreak of armed conflict, especially in those parts of the continent that are already suffering the consequences of these global processes more intensely than most regions. Climate policies, therefore, that are preemptive are necessary to prevent further food insecurity, further loss of life and conflict as a result of climate change. What can we do about this? One of the reasons that we have failed to end conflicts on the continent is because we continue to deal with the symptoms, but not the root causes. I know some people groaned when I mentioned colonialism as one of the causes of where we find ourselves today. However, as Cicero said, to be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child. For what is the worth of human life unless it is woven into the life of our ancestors by the records of history? So we cannot leave the past behind if it remains unresolved and affects the current situation. Therefore, a different way is needed, one which has leadership in place that has a vision and that looks beyond its 4 or 5 year terms in government. Our leaders need to have foresight and develop policies better, because at the moment policies appear to be formulated without any thought for longevity or clarity of thought as to what we really want to achieve as a continent. This goes hand in hand with the lack of respect for institutions, the seeming disdain for developing and protecting them that the leadership on the continent currently displays. Integration needs to be accelerated through the African Continental Free Trade area, like Minister Davis just spoke about. The regional economic communities and other instruments within the African Union architecture, because it is only through development that you can create the capacities that assist countries on the continent to overcome the peace and security challenges that they face. Women need to be included in peace and decision-making processes. They are affected differently and disproportionately by conflict than men. And to talk for them as if they do not have a voice only continues the cycle of unsustainable peace. The average African citizen is 19 years old. The youth are the future, but we continue to treat them as second-class citizens with no agency, when they are the ones most affected and who will be most affected by the decisions that are taken or not taken today. They also need a seat at the table. We need leaders and policies that put the people first, ones that recognize that Africa will only work if we work together, that recognizes that we are one people and have more in common than differences, a way that goes back to the founding principles of Pan-Africanism. Lastly, we need to re-evaluate what democracy means for us on the continent. Is it merely the holding of elections every 4 to 5 years? What is democracy when we have leadership that is not responsible or responsive to its citizens? What is democracy when people go to bed hungry? What is democracy when there is no safety or security? We need to rethink what we mean by democracy because it cannot and should not just be about electing people. It should be about development, about putting people being able to put food on their tables and be able to feed their families. It should be about people having a sense of pride and dignity that they are contributing towards improving their lives, their families' lives, and those of the entire continent. It should be about development, about living a world that is better than the one we found. Democracy should be about having a leadership that knows that it is accountable to the people. Only then can we hope to deal with the underlying causes of conflict on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, my dear sister, for these brilliant points. One of the things that we need at some point to discuss in terms of the conflicts that you are speaking to is the new concept that is taking root in some parts of Africa, what is called the emerging states in Africa. We have comrades from Twaga's Republic Party in the room. They are for restoration. You have in Nigeria, comrades who want to redraw the boundaries. It's happening. We also have southern Cameroons and the other areas across the Africa. So we need at some point to have this discussion. But linked to this also, I take your point on the borders that we need to discuss it in the context of a reunion agenda. I'm born in Zimbabwe. My ancestors were born in Mpumalanga. I consider myself a South African, a Zimbabwean, so an African. So what does it mean? I have lots of brothers who are Mabena in Wamhlanga. I'm a Mabena from Zimbabwe. We need to have this discussion. I know that the minister says his area load shedding is coming at 12, so we might lose him at 12. And Comrade Ian Bidos argues that the load shedding is caused by abandoning national planning and adopting neoliberal policies, which the minister also spoke to. So we invite Comrade Ian Bidos